Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo announced a policy of ending all vaccine mandates on the grounds that, quote, "I don't have the right to tell you what you should put in your child's body," unquote. I'm going to argue that this is false. People do have a right to tell parents what they should put in their child's body. In fact, I'm going to argue in favor of a different principle. A parent has a moral obligation to ensure that what does or does not go into a child's body is in the best interest of the child. Or in other words, the child's right to good health requires that the parent or guardian be a responsible adult and act to secure the child's good health. The parent has an obligation to feed their child, and to feed their child well, meaning proper nutrition. Ladapo's principle would imply that a parent starving the child to death is exercising a moral right to determine what does and does not go into their child's body, and that it reeks of slavery, as he said, to require that the child be fed. My argument will have three parts. In the first part, I'll demonstrate that what the Florida Surgeon General Joseph Ladapo said, that parents have a right to decide what goes into their child's body, is false. If it were true that parents have an unlimited right to determine what does and does not go into their child's body, then parents have a right to rape their children, to force their children to drink bleach, or to refuse to give them food and water at all. My objection to Ladapo's principle is going to lead directly to an argument supporting the principle I gave at the beginning of this video. A parent has a moral obligation to ensure that what does or does not go into a child's body is in the best interest of the child. It'll be a quick argument, since the argument will be that this principle avoids all of the problems identified with Ladapo's principle. I expect that some may want to respond to this by saying that the parent has a right to determine what is in the child's interest. But does a parent have a right to determine that killing the child is in the child's interest? That having sex with the child is in the child's interest? Starving the child or beating the child is in the child's interest? There is a huge area where it is true that parents have a right to make decisions for their child. But that area has walls, moral constraints, that parents are not permitted to cross. In the third part, I'm going to argue that it's not only the child's right, but the right of others in the community to require that parents vaccinate their children. The slogan is that one person's right to swing their fist ends where another person's nose begins. Knowingly spreading a disease around a crowded city is an act of terrorism. Carelessly doing so is an act of negligence at best, showing a wanton disregard for the lives and health of others in the community. We sometimes hear the argument, if your vaccines work, then you shouldn't care if I vaccinate my child. But that's a lot like saying, if your traffic laws work, then you shouldn't care whether I obey them. Some rules work only if everybody follows them. Vaccines, with their contribution to herd immunity, are one of those things. But even if that were not the case, the claim, you shouldn't care that I do not vaccinate my child, is a lot like the claim, you shouldn't care if I do not feed my child. Now part one. I'm going to argue that Ladapo's principle, that a parent has a right to decide what goes into a child's body, is false. I'm going to be using what is called an indirect proof. To understand how an indirect proof works, imagine that the police have arrested you for the murder of a homeless person in Denver on February 26th. We're assuming that the way this murder happened, the murderer would have had to have been in Denver on February 26th. Well, your attorneys collect local security camera footage and credit card receipts showing that you were checking into a hotel in Tokyo at the time of the murder. Now, since you've proved that you weren't in Denver at the time of the murder, you've proved that the police were wrong. You did not murder a homeless person in Denver on February 26th. Note that the indirect proof is a very strong argument. It really does show that you did not commit the murder. Or in other words, it shows that the belief that you committed the murder is a false belief. When I use an indirect argument against Ladapo's principle, I will show that it, too, is a false belief. The claim that I'm going to show to be false is this: a parent has a right to decide what to put in their child's body. If a parent does have a right to choose what goes into their child's body, then a parent has a right to rape their child. After all, a decision to rape is a decision as to what goes into a child's body. If a parent has a right to choose what does go into their child's body, then a parent has a right to choose to inject bleach or drain cleaner into their child's body. If somebody else says that they can't do this, then those people are depriving the parent of a right to make those decisions. And if indeed a parent has a right to choose what goes into a child's body, then a parent has a right to fire a bullet or thrust a knife into a child's body. All of these implications are clearly false. A parent has no right to rape, inject poisons, shoot, or stab their child. And this proves that there are limits to a parent's right to choose what does and does not go into their child's body. Somebody might raise an objection here that all of my examples are cases of putting things into a child's body that do not belong there, and a parent has a right to keep things out of their child's body. But this can be proved false just as easily. Here we're looking at the principle. A parent has a right to choose what does not go into a child's body. If this is true, then a parent has a right to keep food and water out of a child's body, to demand that the child not be fed or given anything to drink, or even to suffocate the child, to put their hand over the child's mouth and deprive the child of oxygen. Or even though the parent feeds the child, the parent has a right to keep vitamin A out of a child's body, even though vitamin A deficiency causes blindness. Or a right to keep vitamin C out of a child's body, even though vitamin C deficiency causes scurvy. Or a right to keep vitamin D out of a child's body, even though vitamin D deficiency causes rickets. These implications are all false. Some things a child has a right to, and a parent has an obligation to make sure that the child gets those things. This includes food, water, and oxygen. It also includes the vitamins needed to ward off blindness, scurvy, and rickets. If a parent cannot provide these things, then that's a tragedy. But if a parent can provide these things and does not, somebody else may need to step in and make sure that the child gets the things that the child has a right to. In other words, the principle that a parent has a right to choose what doesn't go into their child's body is false, or at least it has important limits. Some things a child has a right to, and if the parent does not provide these things, somebody else may have to. This leads to a moral principle that's quite different from the principle that the Florida Surgeon General advocated. A parent has a moral obligation to ensure that what does or does not go into a child's body is in the best interest of the child. This principle is consistent with the fact that parents are morally prohibited from raping their children, injecting their children with poisons, or shooting them or stabbing them. It's also consistent with the claim that parents have a moral obligation to see to it that their child not only obtains food, water, and oxygen, but nutritious food that will prevent them from becoming blind or getting scurvy or rickets. And if a parent has an obligation to make sure that the child gets what the child needs to avoid blindness, scurvy, and rickets, then a parent has an obligation to make sure that the child gets what the child needs to protect it from measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis, whooping cough, polio, smallpox, diphtheria, and so on. Now, this is going to bring up the question of who gets to decide. Again, we can allow that parents get to decide in almost all cases, but a parent does not get to decide if sex is in the child's interest, whether being poisoned, shot, or stabbed is in the child's interest, whether depriving the child of food, water, oxygen, or vitamins A, C, or D is in the child's interest. Are vaccines, then, one of those areas where the parents get to decide? If it were up to me, I would hire somebody who was an expert in the field, somebody with training and experience, to go over all of the relevant data and provide an informed decision. Or better yet, a number of trained and experienced individuals, each having different areas of specialization and able to come together as a group to make joint recommendations. Well, fortunately, I can find 67,000 people who fit this description, and I don't even have to hire them. They offer their recommendations for free. These are the members of the American Association of Pediatrics. And from what they say, it seems that if a parent has an obligation to make sure that what goes into their child's body is in the child's interest, then In almost all cases, it would follow that a parent has an obligation to ensure that vaccines get into their child's body. Almost all cases. I'm not a member of that group. One should ask them. So I have argued that the rights of the child are such that a child not only has a right not to be raped, shot, stabbed, or poisoned, but a right not to be deprived of food, water, oxygen, or vitamins necessary for warding off certain diseases, or vaccines for warding off certain diseases. This argues for an obligation to vaccinate almost all children. There is another principle that supports vaccine mandates. This is known as the harm principle. John Stuart Mill's expression of the harm principle goes as follows. Quote, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. End quote. Now, I don't think that this is the only principle, but I'll not need any other principle here. The principle that I defended earlier in this video concerning a parent's obligation to secure the interests of the child is consistent with this one. It says that power may be rightfully exercised over a parent to prevent harm to the child. If the parent seeks to rape, shoot, stab, poison, strangle, or starve the child, or puts the child at risk of catching certain diseases. However, in this section, I'm going to consider harm to people other than the child. My aversion to my own pain gives me a reason not to put my hand on a hot stove, right? If I'm creating a list of reasons not to put my hand on a hot stove because it will hurt, sits right up at the top. My aversion to my own pain also gives me a reason to prevent others from forcing my hand onto a hot stove, or, to speak more generally, to give others a reason not to do things that could cause me to be in severe pain. I'm not the only one with an aversion to my own pain. It's almost certain that you don't like being in pain either, as well as almost everybody that you know and care about. We all have this reason to make each other reluctant to do things that cause people to be in pain. Our reasons not to be shot, stabbed, poisoned, raped, strangled, battered, robbed, enslaved, and the like. Our reasons to protect our family and friends and neighbors and strangers from being shot, stabbed, poisoned, raped, strangled, battered, robbed, enslaved, and the like, are the reasons we declare these actions immoral and condemn those who do these things. Our reasons to avoid the death and suffering and to protect those we care about from the death and suffering caused by drunk drivers are the reasons we condemn those who drive while drunk, and our reasons to avoid serious illness and to protect those we care about from suffering the effects of a serious illness are reasons for condemning those who put us and those we care about at risk of suffering the effects of a serious disease. And I repeat, if there is any purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will, it is to prevent harm to others. So let me summarize the 3 parts of this video. In part 1, I argued that Ladapo's principle that parents have a right to choose what does and does not go into their child's body is false. If you believe it is true, then you believe that parents have a right to rape, stab, shoot, poison, starve, or strangle their children. You believe that parents have a right to deprive their children of vitamin A and cause blindness, of vitamin C and cause scurvy, and of vitamin D and cause rickets. In part 2, I argued for the principle that a parent has a moral obligation to ensure that what does or does not go into a child's body is in the child's best interest. And a parent has limits on what the parent may choose to be in the child's best interest. A parent may not choose that it is in a child's best interest to be raped, shot, stabbed, poisoned, starved, or strangled, or to be denied basic nutrition that would help prevent blindness, scurvy, or rickets. In almost all cases, this obligation to ensure that what does and does not get into a child's body is in the best interest of the child implies an obligation to ensure that vaccines get into a child's body. And in part 3, I took the harm principle and argued that in the same way that people wishing to protect themselves and those they care about from the death and suffering caused by drunk driving have reasons to condemn drunk driving, Those wishing to protect themselves and those they care about from the effects of a contagious disease have reasons to condemn those who recklessly spread a contagious disease around a community. This is the moral argument for vaccine mandates. Ideally, mandates would not be necessary. But then, ideally, laws against drunk driving wouldn't be necessary. Or laws against raping, shooting, stabbing, poisoning, and starving one's children would not be necessary. Ideally, people recognize their obligations and act accordingly. This video is another example that applies the theory of morality that I defend elsewhere on this channel. If you want to learn more, I'd recommend that you look around a bit. In the meantime, have a good day.